And without further ado, we will jump right on into it. So yeah, thanks again, everyone, for coming. And can you guys hear me all right? We good there? Okay, just let me know if my audio cuts out or anything. My Wi-Fi is not that great, so might have some issues there. So welcome to the first training session for our trail survey. Glad you're all here. Just a little bit about us before we jump into things. My name's Matt. I'm the Terrestrial Invasive Species Outreach Coordinator for the Finger Lakes PRISM. It stands for Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management. We're basically a collaboration between New York State and Hobart and William Smith colleges, where New York State provides funding and Hobart William Smith provides a place for us to house ourselves. And we have the mission of advancing invasive species outreach, education, and management in New York State. And even if you've never heard of us before, you've probably maybe have interacted with us in the past. We do a lot of different education outreach in a lot of different areas. We go to retirement homes, we go to schools, all different kinds of events throughout the region. We also come out with fact sheets, with field guides. You've probably seen our, if you go hiking a lot, which, you know, given this is a trail survey, I'm assuming a lot of you do, our interpretive signs at trailheads, as well as these clean, drain, dry billboards in some roads in the area. We cover a 17 county region, as you can see here. So everything pretty much from Rochester in the west, Syracuse in the east, to Binghamton down south is the area we cover. And we are one of 8 regional PRISMs in New York State. So there are sister organizations to us that are based in other parts of the state. So like Long Island has a PRISM, the Adirondacks has a PRISM, Western New York is a PRISM, so on and so forth. So we're not the only ones. It's a really great partnership, and it's a really great way to advance invasive species outreach, management, education. And the reason why we exist in the first place is because invasive species are really one of the biggest ecological threats that we face. These 3 pictures show 3 of the worst invasive species that we've seen here in North America over the last 100 years. This area in the top left is a forest in Pennsylvania, and you could see all these like brown patches that stretch on off into the horizon. These were all defoliated by gypsy moth. Gypsy moth is an invasive moth species originally from Europe. Their caterpillars eat the leaves of our native oak trees, and they've been able to wipe out entire leaves of trees in entire forests. They've had huge ecological impacts since they've been introduced in the 1800s. If you guys are any boaters or spend a lot of time out of the water, then you might be familiar with this guy. This is the bottom left, the zebra mussel. This is, I guess, an old car that they were dragging out of this lake here. And since zebra mussels have been introduced to the Finger Lakes and into the Great Lakes, they have completely changed the way that the food systems work in those areas, because basically without any natural predators, zebra mussel populations are so high that they're pretty much sucking all of the nutrients out of the water column, leaving pretty much nothing for any of our native fish species. And then on the right here, we see an invasive species of more of concern down south, because thankfully New York State is a little too cold for these guys, although climate change might have something to say about that. This is kudzu. This is a vine originally from Japan. And as you can see here, it is just carpeted this forest. Literally everything on the ground here, all of these trees have just been covered in kudzu without any natural predators. And the fact that kudzu is a very aggressively growing vine, it has just been able to overrun this entire ecosystem, right? And I think these pictures really give a sense as to sort of like why we're doing this in the first place, and what the challenge that we have with regards to invasive species. So what exactly are invasive species? Well, invasive species are basically just any non-native species that is moved to a new area that causes economic, environmental, or harm to human health. And a lot of times invasive species share the same characteristics. Pretty much they all can reproduce at very fast rates. They grow very aggressively. They usually have no natural predators. So we'll get into this a little bit later. But there's really nothing like eating these things, whether it's a plant or an animal. Really important to what we're going to be talking about is they're really good at taking advantage of human disturbance. And they also have really low nutritional value. So even if there are predators in these native ecosystems that might try to feed on invasive species, we like to think of them as like the potato chips of the natural world, where they don't give you a lot of bang for your buck in terms of being a good food source. And when it comes to taking advantage of human disturbance, invasive species are really, really good at this, right? So we as humans, we're changing the world a lot, right? Like we're building roads, we're building houses. And basically what this does is that this sort of resets the natural ecosystem, and it makes it so that invasive species have a really good way of entering our native ecosystems, right? Because our native species, our plants and animals are adapted to sort of pristine forest ecosystems. But we humans have changed the landscape so much that our native species are already reeling, right? And then this gives the extra opportunity for invasive species to come in and take advantage of these new habitats that we're opening up for them. And you might be thinking, well, how does this even happen, right? Like, how does species move from one continent to another? A lot of times, this can be either done intentionally, usually through the pet trade or as ornamental plants, or by accident. A lot of species hitch rides in cars and boats and planes as a result of international trade. And generally, when we're talking about invasive species, at least coming to North America, we're talking about species that are coming from either East Asia or Europe. There's two reasons for that. One is that these are the two regions of the world that are the most climatically similar to North America, right? So a species from like the Amazon is not going to be able to survive in New York winter, right? No matter how aggressive it grows, it's just not going to make it here. But species from Europe and China are going to be able to do that. And then number two is that these are areas where we have a lot of trade already with, right? These are the areas, two parts of the world where we get the most tourists from. These are the two parts of the world that we have the most trade with. So there's a lot more movement between North America, Europe, and Asia than there are in other parts of the world. And when we start talking about the costs of invasive species, they could get really immense. So economic costs, we're talking about impacts on agriculture, on forestry, on trade, on tourism. Environmental costs are catastrophic, impacts on biodiversity, all sorts of natural processes disrupting the food web, and impacts on human health as well. We've seen impacts on water quality, and increase in things like flooding, and even some invasive species like giant hogweed, which we're not going to be talking about today, can actually cause disease and illness. And these aren't just abstract ideas. We could put like specific dollar amounts on these, right? So invasive species worldwide have directly contributed to the extinction of hundreds of species and the decline of thousands more. So this has been one of the biggest drivers of extinction that we've seen in the world as we're sort of living in this sixth mass extinction. And in terms of dollar amounts, in the US alone, we collectively spend $120 billion a year controlling invasive species. This is not a small number. This is a lot of money that we have to put in to keeping these things in check. And a lot of the times, the biggest problem we have is that, like, honestly, we just don't know where invasive species are. They can often spread much faster than we are able to keep track of. And this is why we're starting the trail survey, because we need to expand the scope of people who are looking for invasive species. And the problems with not being able to find invasive species before it's too late is really summed up well in this invasive species curve. So this is just sort of like a generalization of how an invasive species spreads over time, right? So as this this bar gets larger, the costs of controlling that invasive species increase, as well as the area that it infests. So oftentimes we would really like to be able to eradicate invasive species as soon as they get here, right? But the problem is that we, as I said before, the Finger Lakes Prism, at least, we cover a 17 county area, and I work in an office of about 10 people. There's just not enough of us to be able to cover thousands of miles of hiking trails and waterways and so on, right? So we need you guys to really help us get a handle on this, because the problem of not catching these things early means that we end up with scenes that we saw at the beginning of the presentation, right? Where kudzu completely overruns an ecosystem, right? Or gypsy moth completely defoliates a forest full of trees. And then once invasive species usually get to such high populations, complete eradication really becomes impossible. It's just not an option anymore. You're really just trying to keep them under control as opposed to getting rid of the problem entirely. And so that brings us to our trail survey. So how does the trail survey work? So we're looking to have you guys get out there and identify, survey, and report invasive species in the Finger Lakes region. You could really do a great job helping us getting a handle on invasive species and make sure that that $120 billion cost doesn't go even higher. And so who can participate? Pretty much anyone with a smartphone or a tablet. You don't have to be an experienced hiker to take part in this program. You could go on pretty much any trail you want. It's your choice, whether you're a serious hiker and you want to go hike down the Finger Lakes Trail, right? And survey for all different kinds of invasive species, that's up to you. But if you're the kind of person who just wants to go out in their local park and, you know, take a few pictures of what you see, that is totally fine as well. It's really up to you. And so the way we collect data is we ask you guys to survey for invasive species 3 times, once a month during June, July, and August. And the reason why we have that is that it gives you a really good sense of what invasive species are out when. So for instance, like certain invasive species are flowering right now, but other invasive species aren't going to be flowering until the end of August. So this will give you a really good idea, especially if you're not really comfortable with identifying invasive plant animal species yet. This will give you a really good way of being able to see all the different sides of the invasive species as the year progresses. So this whole focus, right, invasive species, as we talked about, can really invade any sort of ecosystem, but why are we surveying trails? Like, why specifically trails? Well, trails are areas that are frequently disturbed, right? So just like how the building of a highway disturbs the natural environment, the building of a trail disturbs that environment as well, right? You have human foot traffic coming in, you have trail clearing, you have people maintaining the trail by removing plants on either side. This gives invasive species the opportunity to invade. They really like taking advantage of these sort of vacuums where an area has been disturbed, it's been wiped clean of all plants and animals, and then they could come in and take over. And oftentimes on the edges of trails, they will have conditions that actually make invasive species really well suited for that area. So this is something what's called the edge effect. So basically, the edge of a forest will have different environmental conditions than sort of the deep interior of the forest. And these conditions, like having a warmer temperature, lower moisture content, more sunlight, these conditions really play into the hands of our invasive species because, again, many of our native plant and animal species are adapted to sort of these dense forested areas. And so they can't really compete as well in areas that have warmer temperatures and lower moisture contents. And this gives you a really good sense of how invasive species can really take over a trail. So if you're looking kind of closely, you could kind of see this little brown patch is where a trail is supposed to be. But Japanese knotweed, which is an invasive species we'll talk about later, has just completely come in, right? And it's just taken over this area. So this is really a good place to look for invasive species. So how are we going to survey? Well, the gist is that you're just going to be looking out in a radius of 50 feet around you. So what you're going to do is you're going to start at the beginning of a trail or a point that you deem is necessary to begin your survey. And you're going to imagine a circle with a radius of 50 feet around you. And you're just going to look out and you're going to identify the invasive species that you see in that area. So it's like, okay, so I'll see garlic mustard over there, and then there's a patch of Japanese knotweed over there, and maybe some like honeysuckle behind me. So using the IMAP invasive species reporting tool that you're going to download on your phone, which we're going to talk about more next week. You're going to report the size of the infestation you see. So maybe you see just a small patch of garlic mustard, or maybe you see an entire acre of garlic mustard. And you're also going to note the distribution of that invasive species that you find, right? So whether it's just a few plants here and there, or whether it's a dense monoculture. And then once you record the invasive species you see, you just move 50 feet down, about 23 steps or so, to the next spot, and you just wash, rinse, repeat as you go down the trail. So we're not asking you guys to go out like off the trail. There's no need whatsoever to not to move from where you're standing. This is really just a visual survey. We're just asking you to notice what you can see and report that. I mean, if you want to go off on the trail and you want to, go find invasive species in the area, you can, of course, but just know that we're not asking you to do anything more than just stay on the trail and just have a look around and see what you can find. And this is a good visualization of how that works, right? So imagine this 50-foot line out in front of you that you sort of sweep around, and you note the invasive species that you find there. And so for the most part, we're going to be talking about invasive plant species. In New York State, we're really seeing the most detrimental effects from invasive plant and invasive insect species. We do have other invasive species like invasive birds and invasive mammals, but in our area, it's really the invasive plants that are causing the biggest concerns. And so we're not going to go too much into the impacts that invasive plants have on our ecosystems, mostly because the impacts that they have are pretty much uniform across the board. There are a few plants that have some interesting ways in how they affect their environment, and we'll note those as we come across them. But for the most part, when we're talking about what these species do that is harming our environment, there's three main characteristics that they all share. They have really aggressive growth. These are plants that can grow really fast, really quickly. The first species we're going to talk about, Mile a Minute, can grow up to 6 inches in a day and up to 25 feet in a year. So much faster than what our native species are going to be able to cope with. And with that growth comes the forming of like really big thickets that end up crowding out native species, right? So in the bottom right here, this is a dense stand of Phragmites, and Phragmites is an invasive species that forms these huge thickets where it's pretty much, if you're a native plant species, there is no way you could ever compete with like a stand of Phragmites like as dense as this. You're never going to get sunlight. You're never going to get moisture. You're never going to get nutrients. Like the deck is stacked against you. You have no chance. And a lot of times these invasive species have very low nutritional value, right? So like what we talked about before, the sort of potato chip effect. Deer really don't eat these plants. And actually some of these plants are actually toxic to deer. So what that means is that the deer will go after all of the native plant species. So even if you are a native plant that can actually compete against invasives, you're going to be eaten by deer, while the invasive plants aren't. So there's just this is a no-win situation for our native plants. And finally, before we go into identification, this is a stand of Japanese knotweed, and it just sort of harkens back to what I was just talking about, where if you're a native plant trying to grow in here, there's no way you're going to be able to to make a living in this area, right? So we're going to jump into identification now. We're going to go through this pretty quick, and if you guys have any questions, just shoot them down in the chat box, and I'll try to get to them at the end. So the first thing we're going to do is that we're going to break these down by the different types of plants that they are. And so we're going to start out with vines. So Mile a Minute is the first vine species that we're going to be talking about here. And like I said, this is the vine that could grow up to 6 inches in a day, 25 feet in a year. Mile a Minute is most commonly identified by its really interesting leaves. So you've probably already noticed that these leaves are almost perfectly triangular. This is the main identifying feature that you're going to see when it comes to mile-a-minute. There's pretty much no other plants in our region that has any leaves that look like this, especially for a vine. They also have these really interesting circular leaves that you'll see at the nodes of the plant. So this is basically where the stem breaks off into two separate branches. You'll see these ochrea, I believe they're called. They're these almost perfectly circular leaves. And that's where you'll find these really distinctive blue berries. That's also very indicative of mile-a-minute. The other main identifying feature of mile-a-minute, other than the oddly shaped leaves, is that the stems will have spikes on them, and this helps the mile-a-minute vine climb different trees. Moving onwards, we have porcelain berry. So porcelain berry is another invasive vine species, but unlike mile-a-minute, which is a herbaceous vine, that means that it's the tissue of the stem is going to be green and soft. Porcelain berry is a woody vine. So this is going to be much more reminiscent of a grapevine. The main way that you're going to be able to tell porcelain berry from something like a native or an invasive grapevine is really looking at the leaves. So porcelain berry has these really, if you could see in the top picture here, these really deep lobes in the leaves. So as you move from one point of the leaf to the other point of the leaf, it will just make this really sharp angle, almost like this valley in between them. And porcelain berry is really the only vine where you see that. Porcelain berry also has these really colorful blue and purple and pink berries that you're going to see on it later in the summer. And what I've also heard about porcelain berry is, oh, excuse me, I'm getting ahead of myself. That's for Oriental bittersweet. Yeah, so these are the deeply lobed leaves and the colorful berries are going to be the main way that you're going to be identifying porcelain berry. Pretty much anything that really strongly reminds you of the grapevine. The vine I was thinking about, excuse me, was Oriental bittersweet. This is another invasive vine species. And these guys are really known for what's called girdling trees. So as you can see here, as the vine wraps itself around the tree, this prevents the tree from growing outwards and eventually causes the tree to die. It's the main way that it causes harm in our ecosystems. With Oriental bittersweet, the leaves aren't particularly distinct. They could be somewhat round, but really what you're going to be looking for is this vine that really wraps itself around the trees in a way that a lot of other invasive and native vines really just don't. And often if you see, if you're out in the woods, you'll see these sort of big twisted gnarled vines just hanging down from branches. This is often the cause of Oriental bittersweet. So that would be another sign to look for. Later on in the summer, you will probably see the really distinctive berries of Oriental bittersweet. So Oriental bittersweet's berries will be, they grow inside this sort of capsule that'll be yellow colored, this sort of this shell that grows around the berry. And then once you get later in the year, that capsule will pop open and revealing the bright red berries beneath. But those capsules, even after they popped open, as you can see in this picture, they'll stay on the branch. So what you'll see is this really striking sort of red and yellow coloration from the berries and the capsules that burst open. That's going to really be the main way that you're going to be looking to identify Oriental bittersweet. Our final vine species are black and pale swallowworts. Although they can sometimes, they're not always growing on other plants, they can be sort of a weed. But basically these are two separate invasive species, both from Europe, but they sort of, they're very similar to each other in terms of identification, and they sort of have the same sort of impact. So we generally talk about them as if they were one invasive species, and they pretty much have the same range throughout our region. When it comes to identifying swallowworts, we need to talk about the leaf arrangement. So most plants have what's called an alternate leaf arrangement, where you have one leaf on one side of the stem, and then some distance will be between that leaf and then the next leaf will be on the alternating side of the stem. And so pretty much the leaves on most plants will alternate from being on right side, left side as you move down the branch. Some plants, however, have what's called opposite leaf arrangement. And this is really going to be the way that you're going to identify swallowworts. So on swallowworts and some other invasive species we'll be talking about later, every time there is a leaf on a stem, there is going to be another leaf directly across from it. And so we call this opposite arrangement. And this will be, as you look on the stem of a swallowwort, you will see this opposite leaf arrangement go down the entire stem. So every time you see one leaf on the right side, there will be a corresponding leaf on the left side. This is going to be the main way you're going to be identifying your swallowworts. It really makes them stand out. Other ways that swallowworts stand out is that they'll have these really long pointed leaves and these really interesting flowers. So this little like star-shaped structure is actually the flower of a swallowwort plant. And really, there's no other plants, native or invasive, that have flowers that look like this. These are really, really distinct. And these flowers, when they mature, eventually will become seed pods. So swallowwort is in the same family as milkweed, and they produce their seeds in the same way that milkweed does, where milkweed has these really big fat pods that are full of seeds. Swallowworts will also have these pods, but they'll be much narrower and longer and tapered. You can kind of see them in the picture down over here. And unfortunately, because swallowworts are in the same family as milkweeds, they have a really unique impact on our ecosystems in that they're really dangerous for monarch butterflies. A lot of the times monarch butterflies will lay their eggs on swallowworts, mistaking them for milkweeds, but the caterpillars can't get the right nutrition from eating swallowworts, so they eventually end up dying. So this is a really big problem for our monarch butterfly populations. So moving on from the vines, and now we're talking about grass species. We're going to be talking about 3 of them, and the first of those is Japanese silkgrass, otherwise known as Nepalese browntop. Grass species can be really hard to identify, especially for beginners, so don't feel too discouraged. These 3 species can be a bit easier to identify than most other grass species. So with Japanese silkgrass, what you're really going to be looking for here is the fact that it forms these really dense mats that spread out across the forest floor. Usually right when you're walking into a forest, you're not really expecting like a lot of grass in the understory. So that should be the first thing that really catches your eye when you see Japanese silkgrass. It's not always going to be like this, but in places where it's particularly bad, you will see these dense mats. And really the main identifying feature is that when you're looking at the leaf blades of Japanese silkgrass, you will see this, this white line running down the leaf blade. This is a feature that is specifically unique to Japanese silkgrass. It's not found in any other grass species. So that's really what is going to be the key identifier for Japanese silkgrass. The only other thing I have to say is that I've heard that pulling out Japanese silkgrass is almost comically easy. They have a really shallow root system, so you could pretty much just pull the entire plant out of the ground with essentially no effort. So if you see a grass and you pull it out of the ground and it just comes right out, that's a sign that you're also probably looking at Japanese silkgrass. Moving on, we have slender false brome. This is a grass that can form sort of large mats like Japanese silkgrass does, but the grass really likes to grow in these sort of these clumps, these bunches, as you can see in the bottom right here. So even though you might encounter an area where there's a really dense mat, you'll see these like little clumps, and you'll be able to distinguish them from each other. That's the first sign that what you're looking at might actually be slender false brome. Slender false brome can be further distinguished if you look at the actual like leaf stems and blades themselves. You'll see lots of really fine hairs running along them. And if you actually take the stems and you break them in half, you'll actually see that the stem is hollow on the inside. So if you take these sort of 3 features, the clumping, the hairs, and then the hollow stems, this can be a really good way to identify slender false brome. Our last grass species, and maybe one of the worst invasive species that we have in New York State. And even if you haven't seen this species before, you almost certainly have is common reed, otherwise known as Phragmites. So Phragmites has a really interesting story. It's actually a native species, but there are basically two like biotypes that are one being native to the US and one being native to Europe. The native biotype is rather slow growing, but the invasive biotype from Europe is incredibly aggressive. And pretty much all the Phragmites in New York State at this point is the invasive Phragmites, unfortunately. Um, this is a easily, other than the vines, the tallest plant we're going to be talking about today, right? So if we assume that this man over here on the right is maybe 5 or 6 feet tall, the Phragmites has to be double his height, right? So we're talking about a plant that's like 10, 12 feet tall. Phragmites is a plant that is most at home in really wet areas, places with a lot of moisture. So we're talking about wetlands, swamps, marshes. They can be found in drier areas as well, but they're really a problem in our wetlands, especially if you go to a place like Montezuma National Wildlife Refuge. You're going to see Phragmites everywhere. Other than like its really tall height, which is going to be the main identifying factor for Phragmites, the seed heads at the top are going to be sort of a wispy shape. You'll see those wispy seed heads at the top. That's really the only other way that you're going to be able to identify Phragmites. This is really a plant that you identify from afar because they're just so tall that they're so easy to catch even at a big distance. Going on to the weeds now, we have none other than Japanese knotweed. So Japanese knotweed, like Phragmites, is one of the most aggressive plants that we're talking about. They form incredibly dense thickets where absolutely no light can get through. There are a few ways you're going to be able to identify Japanese knotweed. Japanese knotweed has these really large circular leaves. So these will be about hand size, if not larger. So that's going to be your main way of identifying them. If you see a plant that has these really round leaves and they are larger than your hand and it's in a huge thicket, that's a really good indication that you're looking at Japanese knotweed. Personally, when I've seen Japanese knotweed out and about before, even though it's not closely related to it, it really reminds me of bamboo, actually. Just like sort of, if you just like look at the stem and the way it grows, it sort of has like the hardness of bamboo. It feels like bamboo. If any of you have like lucky bamboo plants in your in your house or something, Japanese knotweed has just always reminded me a lot of bamboo, even if it's not closely related to it. The main other thing you're going to be looking for Japanese knotweed are the flowers. So they'll have these white flowers that'll be really long and almost like growing on like a line. And they'll in the breeze especially, they'll be really wavy and they're really eye-catching. And these flowers, you'll most often see them earlier on in the summer and in late spring. So they should be coming out pretty soon. So those three factors, large leaves, bamboo-esque, and the long flowy flowers is going to be how you identify Japanese knotweed. Garlic mustard. So this is maybe the most unique species that we're going to be talking about. And this is definitely, if you walk outside your door right now and you went on a trail, this is going to be the species that you might see the most often. So garlic mustard, unlike most plants, is what's called a biennial. So most plants are either an annual, where they grow, just live and grow for one season and then they die afterwards, or they're a perennial, where they will they'll keep growing after every winter. Garlic mustard is a biennial, much like carrots. So they will live for 2 growing seasons. And when they're growing in these 2 seasons, they can be really distinctive. So in the first year, garlic mustard will be really small, really close to the ground, only a few inches high, and they'll have these really circular leaves. And what's always struck in me about garlic mustard leaves is that they have this really prominent veination. The veins are just like really deep in the leaves. They're a lot darker than the rest of the leaf, and they've always been really eye-catching to me. So they'll just sort of live like this for their first year, and then garlic mustard in its second year will shoot up. So it's saved all this energy in its root system, and then it'll shoot up this really tall stem that has actually triangular shaped leaves. So the whole leaf structure actually completely changes. And they'll have these little white flowers at the top. One of the fun ways to identify garlic mustard is that you could actually take the leaves, crush them in your hands, and they actually have like a garlicky, mustardy kind of smell to them. Garlic mustard was originally brought over as an edible plant, and people actually make like pesto out of garlic mustard. It's a totally edible plant, totally safe for humans. It does have some really unique ways that it affects the environment, other than just forming really dense thickets and outcompeting native species, and that it's what's called allelopathic. So literally, garlic mustard sends toxins into the ground that is poisonous to native fungi and other native plants, and ends up directly killing them that way. So again, garlic mustard can be poisonous to other native plants and fungi, but it is not poisonous to humans. It's actually edible, so you can eat them. Just to keep that in mind. Another weed species we have is purple loosestrife. When we're talking about identifying purple loosestrife, there's really two phases to it. There's before it flowers and when it flowers. So purple loosestrife isn't going to be flowering until like late August. So if you're going to be identifying purple loosestrife in the meantime, there's two ways you're going to be able to do that. So just like we talked about before with swallowworts, purple loosestrife has opposite leaf arrangement. And remember, every other plant we're talking about here, like garlic mustard, Japanese knotweed, they all have alternate leaf arrangements, right? This is the default for most plant species. Purple loosestrife has opposite leaf arrangement. So that's going to be a really key identifying factor there. And then the other way you're going to be able to identify purple loosestrife before it flowers is if you look at the stem. The top of the stem will actually be a normal green coloration, but the base of the stem will be this sort of deep red color. That is very unique to purple loosestrife. Once they start to flower in late August, purple loosestrife will have these really beautiful, really prominent pink, vertically grown flowers. And pretty much, if you see these flowers, it's purple loosestrife. You could catch these flowers from pretty much a mile away. So this is a really easy species to identify later on in the year. Purple loosestrife in general is more of a wetland plant. It prefers, like Phragmites, it's really more of a problem in wetlands. So if you're hiking in a wetter area, this is something to be on the lookout for. Although it can also be found in drier areas. It just prefers wetter areas. The good news with purple loosestrife is that we actually have been doing a really good job of controlling these guys. Long story short, we've introduced some beetles from Europe that eat purple loosestrife, and they often don't flower as often as they used to, and they're not as prominent or as big of a issue as being an invasive species as they used to be. This is more of a problem that was really big in like the 70s and 80s. Moving on to the shrubs, we have Japanese honeysuckle. There are other species of honeysuckles that are invasive, but this is really the heavy hitter that we're going to be talking about. Main prominent feature here is you're going to be looking for a shrub that has opposite leaf arrangement. And this shrub is going to be about sort of eye height, maybe a little bit taller. When it comes to Japanese honeysuckle, their leaves aren't particularly distinct. They're pretty small and rounded. You're really just going to be looking for small rounded leaves that are arranged oppositely on the branch. And they have these really showy white trumpet-shaped flowers. You could pretty much find Japanese honeysuckle anywhere, but really being on the lookout for opposite leaf arrangement and prominent white flowers as we get more into the summer. Japanese barberry. Be very careful if you're ever approaching this shrub. Japanese barberry is covered with thorns that can very easily poke through clothes. So just keep an eye out for that. Japanese barberry is distinct in that the leaves are tiny on these guys. Often, like we're talking about like fingernail-sized leaves, easily the smallest leaves of any invasive plant species that we're talking about. And they'll grow in basically like whorls. So they'll grow in a circle along the branch. So it's really distinct when you're looking at it. You can kind of see that in this middle picture here. Other than the barbs and the really small leaves, Japanese barberry does have these sort of oblong red fruits that you'll see later on in the summer. This is a really common ornamental plant, like really frequently planted in yards. Some of you might even have Japanese barberry in your yard, as well as like hotels and golf courses. And usually when you're seeing it there, you'll see the cultivated variety that will be dark red and purple in coloration for the leaves. But when it escapes out into the wild, they'll have their more normal green coloration there. Multiflora rose. This is another shrub, although it can sometimes be sort of mistaken for like a raspberry or a blackberry bramble. When it comes to multiflora rose, just like Japanese barberry, be careful because these guys are roses. They are covered in thorns, so they can poke you pretty good. When we're talking about multiflora rose, you're going to be looking for compound leaves. So with multiflora rose, this entire structure is the leaf. And each one of these, what looks like a normal leaf, is actually a leaflet. This is not too common in the plant worlds, but on species like multiflora rose, they do have these compound leaves. The main identifying structure when it comes to multiflora rose is that when you are looking at the base of these compound leaves, you're going to see these sort of two like upward facing prickles. This is only going to be found on multiflora rose. I don't know if my my bar here for my screen sharing is blocking that at all, but I hope you guys can see it. If you can't see it, I could just send it to you after this. But that's going to be the main feature for identifying multiflora rose. Other than that, they have these really prominent white showy flowers, and they have rose hips. So this is the fruit of pretty much all rose plants. They'll get these later on in the year, but they can often persist through the winter and into the spring. So if you're looking for them now, you might see some old rose hips on them. Common buckthorn. So this is sort of a really large shrub or a really small tree, depending on how you think of it. Common buckthorn is frankly kind of generic looking. The main way you're going to be identifying these guys are their leaves. Their leaves are really small. And they're really rounded. Just something about the roundness of the leaves has always struck me as an identifying characteristic. And then the other main feature you're going to be looking for are these really distinctive blackberries. They're really, as far as I know, no other native or invasive plant species that have these really prominent blackberries like buckthorn does. And they'll have these berries in abundance. You'll see them everywhere. So common buckthorn, small shrub or large shrub, small tree, very small leaves that are rounded, as well as having some blackberries on them. Autumn olive, this is a smaller tree species. When it comes to identifying autumn olive, you're going to be looking for two things. One is that this is almost like a can of worms kind of tree, where you might be able to see in this picture here, you'll sort of see like each branch of the that's growing off of the tree, it's just sort of like splaying out in like every direction, right? It's just shooting upward. I like to think of it as if you're opening a can of worms, right? And the worms just go flying everywhere. It's sort of how I like to think autumn olive grows. And the other main feature you're going to be looking for are like little white or silvery specks. So the leaves of autumn olive are going to be covered in these really like silvery specks pretty much throughout the year. And that's going to be the main identifying characteristic. And you'll see these specks once it flowers and it gets its fruit, it will get these red berries, and you can kind of make out the little like white specks on the berries too. So autumn olive, think this is a tree that's going to have very silver specks on all of its leaves. And then finally, for most of our main plant species, we have privet. There are multiple invasive privet species, but we just sort of lump them into one. When it comes to identifying privet, and this is sort of like a shrub type species, is that they have opposite leaf arrangement, like what we talked about before, and you can see that pretty clearly here on the picture of the stem. They have really long and like thin branches, right? There's a lot of leaves on this one twig. That's a really key identifying feature of privet, long stems that have a lot of oppositely arranged leaves on them. They have these really white, really showy flowers that should be coming out eventually. And then once those flowers mature, they will become these sort of pale blue fruits. And these fruits will actually persist in the winter and into the spring. So even if you're looking at them now, you might be able to see some older ones there. Privet also has some hairs on the twigs, so that's a really good way to tell them apart from like other species as well, like honeysuckle, right? Honeysuckle doesn't have hairs. Privet species will have hairs. So those are most of the invasive plants we're going to be talking about, except for tree of heaven, which we'll get to in just a bit. But now moving on into invasive tree diseases, we have oak wilt, which is a really big concern for our oak trees. This is in our region right now. That's only found in Ontario and Yates County. So if you're going to be hiking around those areas, really keep an eye out for oak wilt. Basically, what oak wilt is, it is an invasive fungus that affects our oak species. And what it does is that you'll see an oak in like the middle of summer, and then you'll see like patches of it where like a lot of its leaves have just turned brown for seemingly like no reason at all. This could be a sign of oak wilt, and oak wilt is really concerning because it can actually kill a full-grown red oak tree in a year. This thing just wipes out oaks really quick. With white oaks, they can hold on for a bit longer, like 5 to 10 years. But for red oaks, this thing really hits them hard. So what you're going to be looking for this summer is oak species that have this sort of browning of the leaves. And you can see in the picture down here, the browning just sort of like will abruptly stop, and then you'll see like parts of the leaves will be green. If you do detect oak wilt, it's really important to get in touch with the New York State DEC Forest Health Survey, because they're taking a really active role right now in trying to control oak wilt before it gets out of control. And if you do find oak wilt, they do need to run tests on it, because there are other fungal diseases that oaks can get that can sometimes resemble oak wilt. But this is something that's really important to be on the lookout for. Another really new and really poorly understood tree disease is beech leaf disease. This is separate from beech bark disease, which is already really hammered our beech trees. We believe this disease is caused by a microscopic nematode. So these are relatives of worms, but you can't see them. They're smaller than what the human eye can see. And we just discovered this. We don't even know how it really got here, and we're not really sure where it's from. There's some researchers who starting to think maybe it's from Japan originally, but it's moving its way westward across the state. It was originally discovered in Ohio, and now it's being found throughout like the Buffalo area, and I believe there might be some that have already been found in Letchworth State Park. So it's moving eastwards. It's really devastating for our beech trees because they're already dealing with beech bark disease. Main thing you're going to be looking for with beech leaf disease is this really prominent like striping of the leaves, and the leaves just like turning like really dark. As far as we know, that's really the only way to detect beech leaf disease. So if you see any beech trees with some oddly colored leaves, maybe take a note that you might have found beech leaf disease. Finally, for our last plant species, at least, we have tree of heaven. This is an invasive tree species that was not really a huge concern on the invasive species front before spotted lanternfly arrived in North America, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. Tree of heaven is you might not even find these guys on the trail that often, but we're really just stressing that people are on the lookout for tree of heaven because of spotted lanternfly. You'll really find these guys growing in like parking lots and on the side of the road and things like that. But you could find them in state parks and along the trail too. The main way you're going to be able to identify tree of heaven especially apart from native species. So we have a native species of trees called sumacs that very closely resemble tree of heaven. So usually when you're looking at it, you're more just trying to tell the difference between tree of heaven and sumacs. So when you're doing that, you're going to be really looking for two things. On the left here, we have native sumac trees. And on the right here, we have pictures of invasive tree of heaven. So both of these trees have big compound leaves. And if you can sort of see on the leaves of this native sumac tree, there's little like points. We call those teeth. And all around the margin or the edge of these little leaflets, you'll see like jagged teeth to them. On tree of heaven, on the other hand, the margin or the edge of these leaflets is going to be completely smooth. So it's going to be the thing number one that you're going to use to tell these two apart. The other way you're going to be telling them apart is through the seeds. So sumac has these really prominent like clusters of like really hairy like red berries. There's really like nothing else like it, and they actually like stand like vertically like on the plant, and they will persist throughout the entire year. So you could look at them spring, summer, fall, winter. They will have these red clusters of berries. And I really just can't understate like how fuzzy they are. They're just really interesting to touch if you ever find any. Tree of Heaven has more typical seeds, so they have what's called samaras. So if you've ever seen the sort of little helicopter seeds that spin around from maple trees, that's what Tree of Heaven has. They're really like flat and papery with a little like bump where the seed is in the middle. And these will only be on the tree in late summer. So if you see something with seeds on it now, it's definitely sumac. If you see something later on in the summer and it has these sort of like flat papery structure, it's going to be tree of heaven. And the reason why tree of heaven is such a big concern is because the only invasive animal that we're going to be talking about is spotted lanternfly. This is public enemy number one when it comes to invasive species. Spotted lanternfly was first detected in Philadelphia in 2014, and it is rapidly spreading throughout North America. Please, please, please be on the lookout for this invasive bug. Their eggs are probably mostly beginning to hatch now, but the real problem with spotted lanternfly is that they eat grapevines and apple trees. So they're like a really big concern for the Finger Lakes region. And what happens is that they'll lay their eggs not only on tree bark, but also on like cars and like outdoor camping equipment. So they can get moved around really quickly. But when you're looking for spotted lanternfly, they have three distinct life phases that occur throughout the year. So when they first hatch from the eggs, there'll be these little nymphs, and they'll be black in coloration with white spots. They'll be about tick or like ant sized. So they'll be pretty small. As they grow up throughout the year, by early to midsummer, they will be much larger in size, and they'll have these red stripes going down their back. And during both these phases, they're still growing up. They don't have their wings, so they can't fly yet. They're just hopping around on plants. And then once they mature and become adults, this is going to be in mid to late summer, but they're going to be really prominent in the fall. And this is when they'll grow their wings. They'll have these really prominent like pink wings with black spots on them. And spotted lanternfly is really distinct. There's pretty much nothing in North America that looks anything like this. But the consequences of spotted lanternfly are really, really important because the apple and grape industries are really important to our region, and getting a handle on this guy, especially now, it's just starting to expand in New York. It's only found in Ithaca in the Finger Lakes region currently. So we have a real chance to get out ahead of spotted lanternfly before it gets out of control. So those are all of the species to identify. And this is just a reminder to be safe out there, right? Don't go off into the bush if you don't have to. Please be careful with ticks. Like Lyme disease is really serious stuff. Like I don't want anyone out there getting Lyme disease. And of course, always watch out for poison ivy as well. So I know we just rushed through a lot of those species there, and especially if you're not too familiar with identifying invasive plants, you might be a little overwhelmed, and that's completely fine. There is a really helpful tool to identify pretty much any native or invasive species that I recommend. So this is not the app that we're going to be using to report later, but this can just be really helpful for identifying invasive species they might be confused about. It's called Seek, and basically the gist is you point your phone's camera at some plant or animal, and it will try to narrow it down as best as it can to what it thinks it is, whether it's family, genus, or species. I actually used it on my ferret yesterday, and it correctly identified it as a European polecat, which is what they are. So where do we go from here? For the most part, it's really just preparing for next week. In the meantime, for the IMAP training, I would encourage you, if you haven't already, to make a New York IMAP invasive species account, and then download the app. And then once you do download the app, join the Finger Lakes PRISM Volunteer Trail Survey. Pretty much other than that, that's all you really need to do. Maybe brush up on some of the species you just learned about, but getting the app so you can know how to report things. And we'll be talking about how exactly the reporting works in more detail in our second training next week. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. Feel free to tell any friends or family or neighbors about the trail survey. We're always taking volunteers, even if they couldn't make it to the training tonight. I just want to leave off on the note of invasive species are like a really big problem, and we've lost the battle to a lot of different invasive species. And we've lost the battle to some species to such a degree that we actually end up thinking that they're native species. Thank you all for coming. Looks like I just made it under the 1 hour mark. I really appreciate all of your interest in learning about invasive species. I hope you're all excited to get out there for the trail program. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot them down in the chat box, and I'll try to answer them as best as I can. And you can see my email down here, gallo@hws.edu. So if you want to go and maybe shoot me a question through email later on, that's perfectly fine too. So let's see, do we have any questions? Let's see, for garlic mustard, what does extirpation of butterflies mean? I think I covered that when I was talking about the what happens with the monarch butterflies. A lot of butterfly species like to feed on milkweed, and then what happens is that they can't really eat the swallowworts that they get confused with. So that ends up having some problems with butterfly populations. If we move 50 and cover 50, we will overlap 25 feet. How much of the trail do I use? So you're going to be moving so that you're just moving 50 feet along the trail. If you feel like you are covering a lot of the same area, you can break that up into like 100-foot chunks. Especially if you're just covering like the same patches of species. It doesn't have to be 50 feet, but that's just the general gist of it. Let's see. Would it be possible to have the PowerPoint emailed out so that we can have all the invasive pictures and information? Yes, I will email out the PowerPoint. Utica, can I use same app in this area? Yes, if you are in Utica and you are slightly outside of our program area, you can still use the app. This is an app that is for all of New York State. It's not exclusive to the Finger Lakes. And just remember that there is actually a PRISM for you in the Utica area. I think it's the SLILO PRISM. So I would do some research into the PRISMs near you, and maybe you can get in touch with them for other invasive species programs. Is there a list of plants we are looking for? I'll send out a list of all the specific plants. And I just want to make a note here that you don't have to look for literally all of these invasive plant species. These are really just the heavy hitters. And if you want to get like the sort of full experience, look for all of these plant species. But if you're the kind of person where, it's like, oh, I know I have a lot of Japanese knotweed, you know, and on trails near me, and I just want to be looking for that, like that's fine. You can really tailor it down where you, if you want to only look for 2 or 3 different plant species, you can narrow it down, mix and match what you want. We just recommend, you know, that we're looking for as many species as possible. So we go to the same location for each of the 3 times. How much of a total length of trail should we cover? Yeah, so you are going to be going to the same trail every time. If you want to go to other trails as well and sort of expand out your search horizon, you're more than welcome to do that as well. You're not limited to just one. But yeah, we do recommend that you just go to the same trail each time because different invasive species will be active at different times of the year. And as for total length of trail, we're not going to, you know, if you're hiking down like a 10-mile trail, we're not going to ask you to go down the whole thing. Just cover as much of a portion of the trail as you're really comfortable with. Should we report spotted lanternfly to a specific agency if we see it? Yes, I will send out information as to how to report spotted lanternfly if you do see it. But basically, the whole point of this program actually is that all of this information that gets reported on the app goes into a database that all invasive species managers in New York State can see. So you are already reporting all of the invasive species that you do find. Like people will be aware of it. That will show up on someone's computer screen somewhere saying like red alert, like we found spotted lanternfly. There are specific like email hotlines that you can send if you think you found spotted lanternfly too. I'm going to send it in the chat here at agriculture.newyork.gov. I believe this is the email address if you're going to be sending any, oh, excuse me, it looks like I sent it to one specific person. This is the email address that you're going to be sending spotted lanternfly reportings to. Thank you. What distance of a trail do we cover? Really, whatever distance you're comfortable covering. If you want to just hike a mile and just hike back out, that's fine. If you want to, you know, if you're hiking on a 5-mile long trail and you want to get everything, that's up to you. We really designed this to be tailor-made, right, to your specific circumstances. You guys are volunteers. We really like to think of this as like you're doing a favor for us. So with that mindset, there's really like no right or wrong answers when it comes to doing things like the number of invasive species you're surveying for, the number of points you're taking, or how far down the trail you're going to be surveying for. How many times we should sample on a hike really depends on how long the trail is, and again, like how many points you're comfortable with taking. Take pics of the sides with your phone so you can bring them onto the trail with you. That's a very good suggestion. Is it better to do a continuous section or observe our circle, walk a while, observe again? So I think if I'm answering this question right, many circles in a row. So you're really just, as you're walking down the trail, the line of the trail, you are stopping, you're looking around in a circle. You don't have to move, but you're standing and you're looking around you. And then you're just observing everything you see there. And then you just move to the next 50-foot location. I hope that answers your question. Let's see here. So it looks like, I'll stop recording too. Where is it here?